I'm happy to invite straight away the man himself, as I've been saying, my mentor, Judge Professor Mervyn King. We saved the best for the last, Mervyn, as I would say, and therefore, may I invite you for your keynote address, Mervyn. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Mahindra. It's been a fascinating and interesting day. But let me just go back to the 18th century, when the first industrial revolution was in full swing. Little did Homo sapiens know that they had started the process for the degradation of planet Earth. And by the middle of the 19th century, we had the establishment of the limited liability company. And because people who had provided capital to start businesses started balking against us, because when the business failed, they were still liable to creditors and employees. So this artificial incapacitated person, the limited liability company, was created, and it is the main instrument through which business today is conducted.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mervyn. Can I request you to put your laptop flap little back so that your full face is visible? Sorry, yeah. Thank you.
So it is the main instrument through which business is conducted today. There are other organizations, but the limited liability company is the critical one. And unfortunately, at the middle of the 19th century into the 20th century, the myth of seeing the shareholders as the owners of the company was created. And companies were directed to increase the wealth of shareholders on the premise that the wealth would trickle down to the impoverished at the bottom. Well, it didn't, never did trickle down. It became treacle and it stuck at the top. So we arrived at a situation where the earth was becoming degraded. This was recognized by the United Nations, and the Brundtland Commission was established in 1983. So it took from, say, 200 years to get to that point, but the earth was already degraded. And Brundtland spent 4 years investigating this degradation, and as you all know, came out with a report that there are 3 critical dimensions for sustainable development. That is the earth, that is the environment, society, and the economy. Or as she quaintly put it, people, planet, and prosperity. And towards the end of the 20th century, we also discovered through expedited research through the third industrial revolution, the computer age of the 70s, that the makeup of the market cap of companies on the Bombay Stock Exchange or London, wherever, only approximately 20% of the market value was being reflected as additives in a balance sheet and financial statements. The rest was not being reported on. And so we as directors were not discharging our duty of accountability. This led to the establishment of the Global Reporting Initiative, of which I became the chair. And at the time I was also chair of the United Nations on Governance and Oversight. And we saw sustainability as how the company made its money, how it produced its product, what had happened with the waste it produced, its output, and what were the outcomes of its product when it went out into society. So we looked at sustainability from the inside out. But at the end, or towards the end of the first decade of the 21st century, there were 2 seismic events. It was the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and it was the GFC, the global financial crisis, which showed us that these 3 critical dimensions themselves were impacting on companies. So the collapse of Lehman Brothers, for example, impacted on companies around the world, including India, their financial condition, their balance sheets, their operating performance, their income statements and their cash flow, their risk profile, their cost of capital. So suddenly sustainability, like a coin, was looked at as two things: the inside-out impacts and the outside-in impacts. And so we have to today look at sustainability on that basis. And the SDGs, which were published in September 2015, were established because, as you already said, the Millennial Development Goals were not achieved. And it was hoped that this would give some direction to all of us, but particularly limited liability companies, to include in their business models an SDG or SDGs pertinent to the business of the company, so that we could try and accelerate the achievement of those SDGs, where the timeline was 2030, which, as we all know, we're not going to achieve that timeline. So, for example, the SDG for clean cities and institutions, sustainable cities, there is now collaboration between cities around the world for how energy is created in those cities, not only coal-powered or fuel fossil energy-driven, but renewables, that there are sufficient green spaces to allow oxygen in the air, the regrowing of forestation in the cities and around the cities. These are becoming now common practice globally to try and achieve that SDG. But we all have to play our role. Fortunately, from the beginning of the 21st century, the model of looking at success of a company being increased profit, increased share price, and increased dividends, never mind that the company's profit was being subsidized by society and the environment, changed completely, and it became a value creation model. Was this company actually creating value for society? And that led to the discussion that really the financial information, the so-called sustainability information, had to be integrated, because operationally they were integrated. So as you reported, they should be integrated. And that led to the establishment of the International Integrated Reporting Council, of which I also became the chair. And integration has become a critical issue. When in 2019 I was able to speak in London before the pandemic as chair of the IIRC, and fortunately before me were the executives of these standard setters and framework providers with good intent, but had created clutter and confusion in the ESG space for preparers and for users. I said to them that it's a moral and social outrage that they see themselves as competitors when they should be collaborators on the SDG 17. They should be collaborating to try and achieve the end game, which is a global comprehensive corporate reporting system, so that we could compare company X in Mumbai with company Y in Mississippi, wherever it was, truly comparable. And I'm told this galvanized some of these executives in these standard setters and framework providers into action. But it was the pandemic that really did the trick, because these executives in these standard setters and framework providers that was creating such clutter and confusion suddenly saw that scientists could go collaborate and develop a vaccine in 9 months instead of 9 years. And that led to them issuing the statement of intent to collaborate. And they have collaborated. For example, SASB and the IRC merged, forming the Value Reporting Foundation, and we sold the Value Reporting Foundation and its intellectual capital to the IFRS. And the IFRS, as you all know, is the oversight body for the International Accounting Standards Board. And through a consultative process, the IFRS has created the International Sustainability Standards Board, which has absorbed the standards for 77 industries created by SASB. And meanwhile, the EU has, through its legal constraints, because they issued some dictates some 3 years ago that by a certain year, no more combustion engine motor cars can be manufactured in Europe. No more factories can be driven by fossil fuels, their plant and machinery. And so they developed and they have issued for consultation standards, European sustainability reporting standards, which are both inside out and outside in, or as it's called, double materiality. Meanwhile, the ISSB has absorbed the SASB, which looks materially at outside in, accepting on the concept which they call interoperability, that every company will sometime or other have something which is how they make their money from the inside, which has a huge impact on outcomes and value, that really it should be reported on to discharge the duty of accountability. And so they started looking at parallel standards, the ISSB. But most encouragingly, in the last 3 weeks, and I've been involved in those discussions, an MOU has been signed between the TRWG, the Technical Readiness Working Group of the ISSB, and EFRAG, the working group of the EU, that they want to try and align these standards, because alignment becomes absolutely critical for assurance. Because assurance would be much easier if these standards were aligned. Otherwise, regulators around the world, different countries, will adopt either these EU standards or the ISSB standards, and we'll have a patchwork of sustainability reporting, which is not the same. And that would be most unfortunate, because this was hoped to be a huge stepping stone towards that global comprehensive corporate reporting system. So let me just end by saying this. The SDGs were created in September 2015 in an attempt to end poverty, to end hunger, and to have food security, to make sure that there was quality education, there was gender equality. And there was, and I make a universal call to action through the Mervyn King Academy for Sustainable Development in Asia, for their work, the world to work together on a collaborative basis to ensure that we leave a sustainable planet for those who come after us. Because my children's children may not be able to operate in a sustainable manner unless we try and achieve those SDGs as soon as possible. Thank you, Mahendra.
Thank you, Mervyn. As always, very articulate, and you've given the entire global landscape which has emerged now for the future of corporate reporting with the formation of ISSB. Though it comes now under IFRS Foundation, IASB has been there for several years, now ISSB. But I must recognize your personal contribution and the contribution of International Integrated Reporting Council and GRI under your leadership to feed into the entire framework that ISSB will be working on. And hopefully, and soon enough, we should have a single global baseline on corporate reporting, particularly for non-financial reporting, and the integrated thinking model should be retained in this.